Okay, so hopefully everyone's logged in now. So hi, welcome to the latest of the Bylines Network webinars. You can submit questions using the Q&A function throughout, so please do that. It's being moderated by Alex, and he'll ask questions as we go along. So to start with, before I introduce the panelists, let me tell you a bit about the Bylines Network. So the Bylines Network is 7 regional publications across the country. It was founded in April 2020 and has really grown over the last year. There are now over 400 volunteers, 3 members of paid staff as well, so it's really growing. There are over 4 million reads across the publications. And writers include such a range of people. So we have MPs, peers, MEPs, local councillors, as well as people in the community that write for the Bylines Network. And volunteers are not only writers, there are huge teams involved in bringing the Bylines Network to you. So there are editors, proofreaders, often the unsung heroes are the proofreaders in the background. There are social media teams, there are picture editors. You know, it's a huge range of people who are involved in the Bylines Network. So it's a brilliant thing to be involved with. So for today's subject, we are talking about social media. So is it digital democracy or is it cash for clicks? So social media was once seen as a great leveler. It was a place for people from all walks of life to discuss ideas, grow an audience, gain a following, connect with people, and it was free. That's what the whole principle of it was. It was about making connections between people. Is that true now, though? Now we see that big brands have big budgets. They can pay influencers, they can produce sophisticated campaigns, they can reach people in different ways using those budgets. So is it still a leveler, or is it now about how much money you've got to spend? So we have a great panel here to discuss this subject. Our panel are spread across different sectors, and I'll introduce them all individually as we go through. Just starting with me, so I'm Mo, I'm one of the people involved in Sussex Bylines, which was launched last summer, and I was involved right from the start of Sussex Bylines, and I write articles for Sussex Bylines from time to time. And in my working life, I'm a businesswoman. I've been involved in business for many years, working in corporations, and more recently, over the last year, founded a diversity and inclusion consultancy business. So I work with a range of organisations on that. And I'm also trying to write a business book as well in my spare time. So that's me. So I'm going to start by introducing each panelist individually, and then they will introduce themselves a bit more, talk about their work, and talk about their thoughts on the subject. So I am going to start with Sasha. So starting with Sasha Langveld. Sasha is an environmentalist, a humanitarian and activist. She was the first Black woman to be elected as Student Union President, 2019-2020 of Kent Student Union. And she's an ambassador for the Girls Network. She graduated in 2018, and actually she's recently just been offered a job. I'm going to let her tell you what that is. So over to you, Sasha.
Thank you very much for inviting me onto the panel, and I'm excited for the discussion. So I'm Sasha Langveld. I just turned 24, and I'm here to talk about social media and whether or not it's a democracy. But before I get into that, what is my new job? I will be joining Friends of the Earth as a community campaigns assistant. So I'm really excited to give back and take up the fight to more of a national level. So I'm very excited to join their team. But yeah, so what do I think about the topic about social media? I think social media in its essence, I think, is a necessary evil. I live on social media, I breathe social media in everything that I do. And, you know, some of my followers and my friends will see that everything that I do is on social media. But whether or not it contributes to democracy or hinders it, I think is a very interesting topic, because in itself, like you mentioned, the creation of social media wasn't for political purposes. It was intended for other reasons. And as we can see in the most recent years, the developing of technology, and as we move into the technological era, how social media is being used to influence a lot of politics, not only here in the UK, but all over the world. We've seen that with Brexit, with the misinformation spread. We've seen that with a lot of political things that are happening all over the world. But whether or not social media can be used to hold governments to account, I think would be a very interesting topic to touch on today. As you can see with, you know, things that are happening in Palestine and in Sheikh Jarrah, and how we can actually hold governments to account for the things that they have been doing onto different types of people. So yes, I'll be interested to hear what the other panelists have to say on this matter, but that's me, I guess.
Great, thanks, Asha. And just one more follow-up question for you. With social media, there are different platforms, right? And they appeal to different kinds of people. As you are considerably younger than me, I'm just interested to know which platforms you think these kinds of discussions are mostly happening now. Do you think it's changed?
I think it's changing, if I'm honest. I would say Twitter is where I would find all the people who want debates. I find myself on Twitter. But I can see the shift in people using different platforms like TikTok and Instagram. Facebook, I think, is being left behind, but the influence Facebook has on the rest of the world is still very impactful. So while, for example, I say young people, I'm talking about myself, while they use different platforms, I can see a lot of the older generation still using Facebook, for example, and having a lot of the influence. Because, for example, when I go on my Twitter, I see so many good things, and I think, oh my gosh, society is changing. But I think what we need to remind ourselves is that social media, especially Twitter, is a microcosm of society. It's an illusion of a progressive society, especially when you're following people who have like-minded views as yourself. But what we have to do is also mobilize outside. In terms of democracy, I can see it influencing online, but it's very dangerous to just stay online and live online, because online isn't actually the reality that we live in now. So I can see a shift. And at the end of the day, it's storytelling. Wherever you can tell a story on and whoever you can captivate with that kind of knowledge, whether it's fake news or factual, people will use whatever they can get. And I know TikTok is on the rise now with a lot of activism and stuff like that. So I really think the shift is changing, but I think majority of it is on Twitter, I would say.
Okay. Well, I think we'll come back to that. It's an interesting subject, so we'll come back to that one. So moving on, I'm going to introduce Paul next. So Paul Mortimer is a former professional footballer, having played with Crystal Palace and Aston Villa. Since leaving football, he's been active in the Show Racism the Red Card campaign to tackle racism in sport. And he's also a consultant, speaker, broadcaster and counsellor. I hope I've remembered everything, Paul. So over to you for a bit more about you and your work and your thoughts on this subject.
Yeah, evening everyone. Thank you. I'm really looking forward to this, and I will be as brief as I can be. I suppose life started for me when I finished playing football. Actually, I had 15 years as a professional footballer. Lucky enough to play Premier League football and the old First Division. For those out there who are a little bit more mature, you youngsters will not know what the old First Division is. Just putting that out there. And it's almost life started for me when I retired, because for the first year of retiring, I suffered from depression because my body let me down, and I just wanted to hide, basically, as simple as that. But I was lucky enough to go back into football as a coach, managed. And the thing about all of this is, a lot of times I'm asked if you're fortunate that when you played there wasn't social media. Yes, I am, to be truthful. Still got abuse, but it was on the Saturday. And then you might get a bit of stick in the papers, and that was it. So I've watched the advent of social media, how it's impacted on my sport of football, where all of a sudden it's now 24/7. And also you look at rolling news as well on sport on TV. There is a constant in your face aspect of information. So now what happens on social media is it is the meeting place for conversations. And not just conversations, people are allowed to spout whatever nonsense they want. And that is the challenge for us all. It's how we deal with that. Now, what's come along, again, I was a player in the 80s where there was a lot of racist abuse. All of a sudden, it's moved from the terraces onto social media. Terraces, it can be dealt with. Social media, you're talking about the platform owners who are sitting on their hands at the moment. So it's become a way of abusing people. Now, the one thing I'll say before I finish is that social media abuse has been there way before racist abuse on social media. You have young kids harming themselves and things like that over bullying on social media. So it's there. Racist abuse is a different thing. Racism a different thing. Social media abuse is a different thing. They're two things that we need to really work on. I think that's about as much time as I've got, Mo. I think.
Yeah. We'll come back to you for more as we go on. So, but we'll move on to introducing our third panelist, Hugh Goulbourne. Hugh is a senior commercial lawyer based in Huddersfield. He's the chair of Kirklees Diversity Innovation Network, business advocate for Huddersfield Unlimited, and a Yorkshire Bylines writer. So Hugh, if you could tell us a bit more about you and your thoughts on this subject.
Thank you, Mo, and thank you for inviting me here this evening. Like the other two speakers, very excited about this discussion and looking forward to talking more. I'm afraid, Paul, I might look youthful, but I'm in my 40s, so I do remember the old First Division. And being a Liverpool fan, I remember winning it many times. So I'm afraid I wasn't, although I know Crystal Palace often beat us, and you probably beat Liverpool a few times. So we'll have that conversation another day. As you said, Mo, I'm a lawyer based in Huddersfield. Live here with my two daughters and family. I'm a business advocate as well, and I do get involved. I think I was mainly asked to come on this to talk about my experience of social media from a political angle. Some people may know on this webinar, I put myself forward last year to be the Labour candidate for West Yorkshire Mayor, and was shortlisted and came third behind Tracy Braben, the new West Yorkshire Mayor who was elected a couple of weeks ago. And so I suppose I've got quite recent experience of using social media for political purposes. And, you know, for me, I'll be honest and say, you know, it was one of the things that probably scared me most about putting myself forward as a political candidate. You know, we're pretty familiar with some of the stuff that Paul's talked about and Sasha around, you know, some of the difficult comments you can get on social media, and I think we will get into that more as we go into the debate. And so it was one of the things I had to consider quite actively, right, before I got involved. But equally, you know, and I think Sasha touched upon this, it's also for someone like me who started without any real profile, you know, I've got a business profile, but not a political one. It is also an opportunity. And I think that's the first thing to say, really, in the political context. You know, with my mayoral campaign, I didn't have a big budget, and I was able to build some profile relatively quickly using Twitter, Facebook, to a lesser extent, but Twitter and Instagram. And I don't think that would have been nearly as easy, say 15, 20 years ago, when I would have had to have done that all using press releases, some sort of PR firm, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it has opened up democracy in that sense. You know, it enables us to run campaigns on a much smaller budget and to reach a much wider audience. And I think that's an important starting point. And that was something that we did quite effectively in the mayoral campaign. I had a team of volunteers. I mean, I'm no expert on social media, I should add, but luckily I had a team of volunteers from the business world and the community world who helped me quite a lot and continue to help me and give support in terms of particularly my Twitter profile and the content we put on there, and ensuring that it's quite rich content. And I think that's the next piece that I think is really important and that I'm starting to understand now, is that, you know, really in terms of the content you put out there, that's the critical bit. You know, social media is quite rich now. Most people have a Twitter account or an Instagram account or Facebook account or some other account. And so now I think the competition is becoming about content. And so whilst I'm very hopeful about social media, I think one of the things now we need to consider is the fact that it is a political tool. And we saw in the recent US elections last year, for example, I mean, hundreds of millions of pounds were spent by both major political parties. I think Donald Trump spent over 100 million pounds alone on social media, and something like 80 million pounds on Facebook ads. And Joe Biden wasn't very far behind. Now, these are astonishing amounts of money to be spending. And so it shows now that it's become quite a big part of the political apparatus when you're going for campaigns and for elections. And I think that that's where some of the caution now needs to be. We need a little bit of caution now about social media, because as Paul has referred to, the rules of social media are not particularly clear. So who can use it? What accounts are in place? What you can say. I mean, there's no truth regulator on social media. So you can say absolutely anything you want at any time, and you can say it in any way. You know, there's some emerging regulation, but it's still not particularly strong. And so I think we do need to be more vigilant about that. You know, it shouldn't be possible just to say anything you want at any time to anyone in any way. And so that, I think, is a concern going forward, particularly when such vast amounts of money are being spent. And I think in terms of that spending, I think we do need some more clarity about who's spending it, where and why, and for what reasons. We're very, you know, there's a lot of research going into now independent bodies spending money, supporting candidates outside of the electoral spending that you're allowed to do. And I think we need a lot more clarity on that. So I'm really hopeful. I think it's a great tool. We've used it very effectively and I continue to use it. But I do think we need these sorts of debates because we need to be much more vigilant as we go forward. Otherwise, you know, it could become quite a perverse thing for our democracy and could enable people to kind of own it simply by outspending others and using it in, you know, in more and more dark and perverse ways. I'm looking forward to debate. I hope that's a useful introductory set of remarks.
Thank you. I've just got a kind of follow-up question to that, Hugh, in that what can smaller organisations, campaign groups do in the face of the spending? Because as you say, it's about the content. And I say that as somebody involved in the Bylines network who, you know, social media is how we get the word out and how we get the articles out. So what do you think that smaller organisations can do in the face of that big spend and big advertising?
Well, I think there's two bits to it for me. One is there is understanding, and we might get into this a bit, which is the big data piece, right? You know, one of the things that I suppose you can't get around to some extent is the software that you need to use to analyze what's going on social media. And that's one of the areas where I have concern, because I don't think there's much way around that without spending more and more money. And that's the bit that, you know, luckily for some of my campaigns, I've had access to some of that, but you do need resource to do that. And I think that's part of the bigger debate that often isn't considered, is that a lot of businesses, a lot of campaigns are spending a lot of money on that data analytics, and you do need resource and funding to do that. I think on a lighter budget, I mean, I've got a very good example recently. We've just had local elections here in Kirklees in West Yorkshire. And, you know, we managed to lift one of the local councillors, who's been a councillor for 30 years, a fantastic councillor. We managed to lift his campaign by just making his first ever video. And, you know, we all know that people interact better with videos. You know, there's still a lot of candidates putting out a lot of blog posts, a lot of text posts, sometimes images. But we lifted his campaign. We made a video. We did it in quite an agile manner. We did need some post-production editing, but we did it all on a phone, on a smartphone, and then edited it. You know, brought it down to 1 minute and then boosted it on Facebook and on other platforms. And, you know, you can do that for a very, very small amount of money. So, and it's really more about volunteer support and volunteer effort. So that's the sort of example of something where it's just about considering the type of content you want to put out and thinking about the sorts of content that people actually want to consume.
Yeah, and I think there have been some campaigns, you know, that haven't been very expensive. They've caught the moment and have been really effective. So I've kind of got a question for all of you on this, actually, about what you think about that and about kind of awareness campaigns that go on social media. So the examples I have are the black squares on Instagram last summer, brands turning their logos pink for International Women's Day, things like, Paul, there was the football campaign a couple of weekends ago where you all went silent on social media. So actually, I'll come to you first, Paul, and kind of ask your thoughts on what you think about that and whether those things really achieve any change.
I think they're a great idea because, let's say, what happened in my house, I've got grandkids, and my oldest grandkid actually asked what it was about. So what it did was it started him thinking about it all. So to a certain degree, if we can do things on social media that start to prompt the conversation, that's hugely important, just to put it out there. My worry about all of these, and I've spoken on this before, is it becomes all that happens. It becomes all that happens. The squares go dark, but what comes from that? You know, the media blackout the other day, great idea, but why 3 days? Why not 5 days? And also, it was over the bank holiday weekend where there was very little real football. Now, if they did it over, let's say, England's first game of the Euros, it would be huge and it would actually mean something then. But that's not going to happen. So you start to look and think, are people, when they do these things, really taking them seriously? Because if you take them seriously, there's got to be some sacrifice involved. It's got to hurt a little bit. And we don't do that. We talk a lot. And you know, everyone's, I see the black squares. Everyone's put the black squares up. Fantastic. So is that all you're doing? What comes after the black squares? What comes after all of this? So that's it for me. For me, in my house, the way it helped to educate my grandkids and people around them, brilliant, because it put the conversation out there. But there comes a point where it's got to mean more than just a black square, more than just a media blackout for 2 or 3 days.
Yeah, okay. Sasha, I see you were nodding a lot there. So, what do you think about this? What are your thoughts?
I think I definitely agree, but I feel like there's a difference between a brand and performative allyship. I feel like both of them together, they don't necessarily work into. For example, if it's about a brand awareness or raising awareness for a specific thing like mental health or, you know, challenging something like that, I think, you know, there's nuance to it, that, you know, there's context to that. People have put time into that. But for example, when it comes to performative allyship, what we see in even the recent week with what is happening in Palestine is people feel obligated to join in on this conversation without actual real understanding of what has happened, and they just post things for the sake of posting. And when we go back to the black squares, that really does nothing for Black people. And then what we saw for that in the lead up to what happened with Sarah Everard and Meghan Markle, and the police brutality that came after that, people were still shocked that police brutality existed. And I'm like, well, where have you been for the last couple of years? Like, it's, you know, it's always been here. So why are you so surprised? So I definitely agree with Paul in terms of, like, it needs to be more than black squares, especially when it comes to things like racism and talking about things that really do oppress other people. I feel like the conversation needs to be bigger than that. And for example, when that all happened unraveled, I was at the time Students' Union president, and I immediately was calling the uni, was emailing them, being like, whatever you do today, do not post that black square, because there will be some backlash, and I will be one of them be in the backlash. So I feel like people really need to take the time and understand why they want to be involved in certain campaigns and do the legwork. Like, Google's free. Like, you can really take a step back. Like Paul said, you know, these things need to come also with making yourself kind of feel uncomfortable and also some hurt. You need to educate yourself to then move forward. We can't just have black squares and no action. So I definitely agree. And I think there is a fine line between performative allyship and brand awareness. And I think, yeah, that's what I think about that.
Yeah, thanks. And Hugh, connect the same question to you, but I'm interested in your thoughts from the political angle, because some of the political parties do get involved. Their brand decides to get involved in some of these campaigns and awareness things too.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. And I guess I've got a couple of reflections, right? I suppose, I think one of your questions is about a good example of, you know, where it's been used, social media, in a powerful way. I know when we spoke before, we talked a bit, and Paul will be very familiar with this, around, you know, the Marcus Rashford campaign.
Yeah.
And, you know, what an icon he's become for that campaign. But, you know, a lot of it was led by social media. And, you know, having not, well, what really interested me was the day, you might recall, where he managed to get lots of different organizations, particularly restaurants during lockdown, to volunteer food to local schemes that were giving to families that were in need locally. And then on his Twitter feed just had a succession of things saying thank you to this restaurant, or thank you to that takeaway, etc., etc., which I thought was incredibly powerful. And I think that's an example of what Sasha and Paul have been saying about not just using social media to perhaps make a sort of statement or something, but actually trigger change. You know, a lot of those organizations then saw it and said, okay, I want to get involved because I've seen the restaurant down the road is doing that, so now I want to get involved. So that I felt was a really good example of somebody using social media in a really active way. In terms of political parties, yes, you're absolutely right. And I mean, I think the Labour Party has at times aligned itself to some of those campaigns in terms of Marcus Rashford and some of the holiday hunger stuff as well. But I wanted to also take this somewhere slightly different, which is to pick up on the point that Sasha made about the discomfort of social media. I mean, one of the things that we've tried to do, and I won't say we've been perfect as a campaign, is and often it's my volunteers who've encouraged me to do this, is to actually engage with people who say things you don't like. You know, not when it's said in a hostile way, or obviously from an account that's been made up or whatever. And we get a lot of those, or if it's just a repetitive point. But if it's an actual genuine statement where somebody's asked us a question, just because we don't like that question, because it comes from, say, a different political standpoint or something, I think it's really important that we start to have what I would call maybe version 2.0 of social media, where people really use it as an engagement tool, a way to talk to different people from different perspectives and standpoints. Because, you know, we're a planet of several billion people, and no two of us actually have exactly the same thoughts on anything. So I do think we need to, particularly for political discourse and for the political parties, we do need to start to see as a way to actually have a richer conversation, right, about things, and disagree well about things, and then move forward, rather than just seeing it as a statement is made and then somebody else makes a statement and then you sort of try and take somebody off because you just don't like their idea. So it's this thing that Sasha was saying about, we've got to try and get out of the echo chamber effect, which I think is where social media is getting to a little bit at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's where a lot of the kind of the concern is, that people are just in their own echo chambers. And, I'm certainly one of those people that then gets surprised about results of things, elections and things, because I've surrounded myself with people that agree with me. So yeah, I think that's the sort of danger of those kind of platforms. So that kind of brings me on to my next question, which is about online abuse that people face, but actually with a bit of perspective of something you've just talked about there, Hugh. We need to be able to disagree with people well. So, and social media is a very immediate thing, and also it's somebody behind a keyboard, so you don't get to see the person and interact with them. So I'm interested to hear from all of you and what you think people can do about that, about the fact that there are people that are going to disagree with you, and how can we disagree well, if you like. So Paul, I'm going to come to you first on that one.
There's a couple of things. As you were saying, that you can't disagree with abusive people. You can't. There is absolutely, it serves no purpose. If people are being abusive to start with, they're not listening. They just want to say what they want to say. So you really can't, there's nothing you can do about that, to be truthfully honest. But the thing about social media, it is a place where you can put the discussion there, and you can have discussions, and you can disagree. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I've learned a lot from people that I haven't agreed with, because I realize I do not know everything. So it's important, and I think what sometimes we don't do on social media is we talk, but we don't listen. We're so quick to put our opinion across and influence and impose it on other people, is that we actually don't listen. We don't pay attention, and we don't read enough. And that's the single most important thing, is to be able to, I mean, what I'll do, some people have come back at me with stuff, and I'll say, well, how, why? I'll ask the question. And sometimes that does diffuse the situation, because a lot of people do go onto it and they're ready for a fight. And what I want to try and to be able to do is to say, it doesn't have to be a fight. We're allowed actually to disagree. As Hugh said, no two of us are the same. We're going to see things differently. We're allowed to. So it's important that it becomes a forum where we can have discussions that are not personal. It's a point that we've put out there. We may see it differently. I've learned a hell of a lot from someone saying to me, have you viewed it this way? And I was like, no, because I've always been told this is how it is. A bit like yourself, Mo. I've had people around me who've agreed with me. We need people around us to disagree, because it challenges our knowledge as well. It tests our understanding as well. Because you know what? They might be right. They may know more. They may not. But it's important to put the conversation out there, because other than, if you don't, what comes up then is it's just two people abusing each other. And that gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And then they cross a line and they get blocked, or the police are involved, and it becomes some sort of discriminatory abusive act. When at the start, really, it was two people who just wanted to ask a question and couldn't ask it and listen to each other's answers. And that's where we need to go. We just strip it back to, let's just have that conversation. I may still disagree with you, but I have respected and honored you enough to be able to hear what you've got to say. And conversely, the other person has to do the same thing. And that's why there's confrontation, because whereas one might do that, the other doesn't, because I just want to get my point across. I don't care what anyone's got to say. This is what I believe in. And, when your beliefs are being challenged, not told they're wrong, when they're being challenged in your head, from my mouth to your ears, you think I'm telling you everything you believe is wrong. I'm not. I'm saying, explain a little bit more to me about it, so that I can go, oh, right, I get it now. And we never get to that point, because the hurdles are abuse. Let's just call someone a name and get on with it. That's when we feel we're not being heard. And we've got to move away from that and allow the conversation to be put out there, so we can all take what we need from it, but we can also give back a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And Sasha, what do you think about that, about disagreements? How can we handle them better?
I feel like disagreements are disagreements, but when you're questioning someone's basic human rights, like that's a whole different conversation. Like, for example, we can disagree on, there's the saying of, we can disagree of whether you like pineapple on pizza, but you can't disagree that, racism doesn't exist. And I feel like that in itself is something that we really need to get over on social media. Like, there should not be any room to be racist or homophobic or transphobic or sexist. And I feel like we can have active disagreements. Like Paul said, myself, I don't know I don't know everything. And social media is a great tool for awareness and education. But when it comes to basic, just facts and things that are questioning people's existence, I feel like those conversations, why should they be up for discussion? And I feel like when we're looking at, for example, things like racism, like I understand that some people may say something because they are unaware of how it may sound and they just need more education. But at the end of the day, we can't assume that every person who is of that community wants to educate people. Sometimes people want to come on social media to express their own views, but not want to educate other people. Like, for example, I might have a thought of, I read a great book that day and I want to tweet about that. But then I don't want to go out of my way to educate people because that's not my job. I'm not paid to educate people. So I feel like, Google's free. Like, when you have a very controversial topic, do your research and stuff like that. And I think from your research, you'll know whether or not something is up for debate. And, still then, it's still something that you might want to challenge in a respectful debate. But when it comes up like things like racism, I really don't see how people can respectfully disagree with that. And I think there's more topics like that which can't be disagreed with. There's obviously nuances to political things that are happening, but I think in my opinion, in most cases, there is an obvious side. And we can see with what's happening with, for example, the oppression of the Palestinian people, for example. People obviously say there's two sides, but actually it's not that complex. There's the oppressed and there's the oppressors. And I feel like when we're talking about that kind of disagreement, I feel like it opens the door for a lot of other things that actually don't help the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Sasha. Yeah, some interesting thoughts there. And Hugh, you touched on this already, but yeah, interested to know what you think about things you've learned about disagreeing with people or people that disagree with you.
Yeah, well, I mean, some really profound points made there by Paul and Sasha. And I mean, the first thing I'd say is, I very much agree that this piece around, it's a completely different thing. You can't be abusive, right? And I think that takes me to a place around, I referred to it in my opening remarks about there is some responsibility, and I know Paul mentioned it, on the actual social media providers, I think, to do a lot more in terms of how they moderate their platforms, right? I mean, I know they often invoke free speech and other things as their kind of defense. But, my analogy is, if you're out on the street and you just go and say something abusive to somebody, well, that would technically, could be some form of assault, right? So then, why can you do it online, and why can you be allowed to get away with it? And it's important that people have a sense of responsibility in the same way as they do in the real world, in the virtual social media space. And so I think some of the interesting things that they've done in other countries around creating a social media identity so that we all have some form of identity and it's easier to track back to who we are and where we are, I think is really critically important. And this is quite important for the political space, where we often see, and this comes to your question directly, we often see these sorts of ghost accounts appearing. That person then says whatever they want on Twitter, Hugh, what you're saying is completely ridiculous because of X, Y, and Z, or it's just a lie, or whatever. And okay, it might, under the new rules that Twitter seems to now use, after a couple of days it disappears and their post disappears, but it's there for 24 hours, right? And in that time, as the point Paul's making is a good one, that somebody might have read that, hundreds of people might have read it, and then they've taken that in as their truth, and that's become truth to them. So I think it's really, there's a lot more work that needs to be done around that particular space. And obviously it's a very live debate at the moment. We've got certain bits of legislation going through Parliament that, you know, the current government says will manage that. I think there's quite an active set of disagreements around that. And I'm a bit more encouraged by some of the stuff that's going on within the European Union around this, and actually, ironically, even in the US, where Congress, etc., are starting to look at this quite seriously, are starting to look at taking a bit more action. And I think we will have to follow that here in the UK, hopefully, as well. Because I think then that enables us to create a space where we can have that more, that richer discussion, and have discussions the way we do all the time, you know, in real life, about different elements of belief, based in fact and based on evidence, right? So that, as Paul said, and as Sasha has said, you know, when you're making a point, you should have to back it up with some evidence. You know, you might. So, you know, it's fine to have a belief, an argument that says, I don't believe that there is discrimination in this particular sector on this, but then you have to back it up with some evidence, right? And that's because that's based on this academic or that academic or this research, etc. And we're all very happy to have that debate, aren't we? But I think, as Sasha's saying, what we're not happy to have someone who gets on just is allowed to say, well, there is no such thing as racism, it doesn't exist, it's never existed, and can say that in an aggressive way and just keep saying it without any fact or any evidence behind it. So, you know, I think that's quite important. And I guess the example for us in terms of our recent campaign is, you know, I was very happy, and we engaged all the time with people who said, you know, I don't agree with this policy, or where's your evidence for that idea? Why do you think transport could be improved because of this? Or actually, you know, I think that's a terrible idea because of X or Y. That's fine. You know, that's what we want. That's what politics is about. We only improve by doing that. But where people just came on and said repeatedly, you know, I don't agree with you because you never voted for Jeremy Corbyn, or I don't agree with you because of this, and repeatedly do it, you know, and you've already feel like you've made an answer, then that sort of thing just isn't respectful. And to say, you know, you're not a Labour person because you never do this or that, even though there's not even any truth to it or any fact, that sort of thing we need to try and get rid of that, because it just isn't going to help anything move forward. There's no progress that comes out of that kind of debate.
Yeah, for sure. Audience, if you have questions, do submit them in the Q&A. We're going to come to audience questions next. I've got one more question for you all before we move on to those questions. And it's around what you think the main influences are now. Do you think people are more influenced by what happens on social media now than news sites, news programmes? Do you think actually it's more about what happens on social media or not? So interested to know what you think. Sasha, I'm going to come to you first because you're nodding.
I generally think social media influences the media, and the way that I see that is, for example, I'll wake up at 7 or 8 and I will go through my Twitter and I will flick through it and I will have the news, like it will be a live update, and then my sister's partner, for example, will click onto the 7 p.m. news, you know, dead on 7, to be updated of what's happened in that day. And then they will be saying everything that I've literally read on social media in the morning, because it's a live update from people who are experiencing this. But then I think we also need to have the understanding that a lot of these big news outlets are also influenced by politicians and social media in itself. So it's like they have buy-in to what is actually published. And I, you know, call me a conspiracist or whatever, but you know, it's true. Like, we can see what's happening with how, for example, the news outlets, you know, depict just things that are happening, like what happened with Jeremy Corbyn. We can see with how he was shown, whether you like him or not, how he was shown online, and how media outlets came for him and depicted him in a different light compared to other campaigns, for example, such as Boris Johnson. So I would say social media, influences the media, or it pushes them to start to talk about something. For example, I'll see something on social media and then it will gain a lot of, you know, I would not necessarily, popularity is not the right word, but it would gain a lot of social media interaction, and then suddenly it will be on the news the next day. So I would say I'm a key person to say social media comes first. Maybe it's because I also follow a lot of activists and they're the people on the ground doing a lot of the work. So I think it really depends who you follow, and I guess it goes back to what we've all been saying about the echo chamber and how it is really a microcosm of society, because when you do have, you know, a certain group of people who you're following, that's all you're going to be hearing. So it really depends, I guess, on your following and who you're exposing yourself to. But I would say, in my personal opinion, I would say social media influences a lot of the things that we do.
Yeah. Paul, what do you think?
Yeah, I make that quite right, but I had to scribble some things down as Sasha was talking. I mean, what people do now, I mean, I'll take, you know, my wife, for example. When she wakes up, the first thing she does is she goes for her phone. Yeah. And she's looking at social media. I took a look at my kids, who are adults now. We'll have a get together at our house. When there's a lull, they go to their phone. They go to social media. That's what they do. Now, as a kid growing up, I used to love the news. And I'd get up in the morning and watch the breakfast news, and then I'd watch the lunchtime news, then I'd watch the 10 o'clock news, all of those. Don't do it now, because where people go is to their phone. And the best example I can give is currently a topic of interest in football is the Tottenham striker Harry Kane, who's decided to hand a transfer request in. That pinged up on my phone before I saw it on telly. It was in the social media before it was on TV. And as Sasha says, and again, it's the conspiracy aspect. If someone wants to promote something, if someone wants to put something out there, you know, they can do it in the social media field, and that's where it has traction. You know, again, in football, another topic of conversation has been the Super League. I think the outcry on social media is what did for it. Europe-wide, without a doubt, it was huge on social media. So again, I go back to what Sasha said. If someone wants to influence it, if the media want to go after someone, if they want, and she spoke about Jeremy Corbyn, spot on. If they want to do that, and people are prepared to listen to it, the media through social media can have a huge impact on building someone up or tearing them apart. And we buy into it. We do. We all go for our phones. We do. And like I said, I used to love the news. I don't. I'm on social media. It's the first place everyone goes. Is to social media. Is to what people are saying. Is the rumors. Is the news on social media. And does it influence us? Of course it does. Is it the biggest influencer? Over my years growing up to where I am now, with the advent of social media, now you can get news like that. You don't have to wait till midday or 10 o'clock. In fact, the 10 o'clock news is obsolete by the time 10 o'clock comes along, because you know it all, because of how important social media is. So to answer your question, yeah, it's huge, and it's a huge influencer, and it's a double-edged sword, because it can be positive, as Hugh said, Marcus Rashford. It can be negative also, Jeremy Corbyn, where it can impact on how we are conditioned to view something. And so it can be dangerous. And that's why it needs to be regulated in some way, shape or form.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Thanks. And Hugh, a quick comment from you on that before we go on to audience questions.
I think I'd echo a lot of what has been said by others. I mean, I suppose my only reflection is, it's an interesting test, isn't it? And it's an interesting test to have in our own minds. Is BBC any longer a broadcast media or social media? Because to Paul's point, he's absolutely right that actually, I think a lot of people on their phones, probably the website that they hit the most is probably, certainly on mine, it's the BBC app. And so, but I do treat it more like social media, I'd say now, rather than broadcast media. I certainly don't, as Paul said, I very rarely would watch the news unless I'm very bored on TV, but I'm always hitting the app, right, on my phone. So it's kind of the changing face of this thing. And then it becomes very powerful, I suppose, when you're the BBC and you have both, right, in your armory. So I think there's some caution needing there. I'm a fan of the BBC, by the way, but there is some caution needed there when you have control of the whole thing from one end to the next. But yeah, let's get on to some audience questions.
Yes, Alex, do you want to come on with some questions? Hello.
Hello. Yes. Okay. So we've got a brilliant question in here from Andrew, going back to that regulation question which you mentioned briefly, Hugh. Should there be a truth regulator? What are your thoughts on social media regulation? Nice big open question.
Who wants to go first on that? Hugh, yeah.
since I raised it, as Alex said, I should probably take the question. I think a truth regulator. I think we're into risky water there, aren't we? Because who regulates the truth? So I think we have to be careful with that. I think where I think regulation is needed is in relation to this big data question, because in a world where we both from the supply side and the demand side, right? So we as individuals can just make up anything we want and set pretty much at the moment. And then until the way the algorithms work at the moment, until I say something wrong or repeatedly wrong for long enough, I don't get taken down. So I do think we need a bit more, and there are countries doing that. You know, the famous one is, I think, is Estonia, where you have to have a digital identity to have any form of social media. So I do think we could learn from that. It's already been used, it's been trialed with millions of people. We know it works. So I think on the demand side we need to do that. And then I think on the kind of, the danger of something like Facebook is, yes, it's fantastic that I can put up a post and then boost it to lots of people. The slight thing that worries me is the fact that, they can make in effect a group of people who constitute a group, right? And that I can then post my direct it quite targetedly at that segmentation of society. And so all that's doing is reinforcing the stuff that Sasha said around this echo chamber stuff, because I'm just saying the same messages to those people and influencing them in a certain way. And I think we do need to think about that. Is that the way we really want our society to go? And is that the right kind of platform that we want? So I think some regulation around that and how you can use it and when you're allowed to use it, I think is quite important as well. Because there's no doubt that political parties are using that kind of big data scientists at the other end, analyzing what their target audience is, how they might respond to certain messages, and then using these platforms to mobilize them in certain ways. There's no doubt that's happening. And so I think, we do need, this is the moment in time when we can still take action on some of that.
Yeah, Sasha, did you want to come in on that?
Yes, I'll try and be quick, sorry. Just to add on what Hugh has mentioned already, I know that Twitter, for example, has been doing are you sure you want to tweet about this if you haven't read the article? And I think that's great. But I think also when it comes to truth regulators, or like you said, who's telling the truth? But I also want to focus on censorship. As we move on to, I know we've said the technological era, blah, blah, blah. When we are moving on to being, living online. But when we look at different countries, for example, countries that censor what is happening around the world, who is telling the truth? We see that with, for example, what has happened in Uganda in the last year, what was happened in Iran, what's happened in Myanmar, and what's happening right now in Palestine. How governments shouldn't be allowed to a certain degree censor what people are entitled to say online as well, because at the same point, it's like when you have an oppressive government, it's like, who's telling the truth? So I think more work needs to be done in giving more power to the people rather than government forces. So I just wanted to add that in really quickly.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Sorry, Paul.
Sorry, very quickly. I know you were talking there, Sasha, about censorship and control. I've always worried about all those because, again, I always worry about who makes the decisions, who's in charge, who can we trust? Because, for me, growing up now and knowing what I do, I find it very difficult to trust absolutely anyone. With my data, with absolutely anything. And when we're talking about regulation and things like that, I mean, if we're looking at social media abuse at the moment, where kids are harming themselves, taking their own lives because of online bullying, yes, we do need to find a way for people to be accountable for their behavior on social media. I don't know how we do that. That's the thing for me. I don't know how we do that and hit all the criteria we need to hit around freedom. That's the worry for me, but we need to do something about it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Alex?
Yeah, so we've got a couple more on the Q&A. Be sure to keep on checking questions into there. So a question from Vicky here. So has COVID and lockdown and the associated frustrations about not living our usual lives fueled the worsening of social media abuse?
Yeah, Paul, what do you think about that? Do you think COVID and lockdown has kind of accentuated all of that?
Yeah, it has, because you see, we can't get out. So now we're in. Often we can get out and maybe diffuse our tensions elsewhere. But we are indoors. We are stuck indoors. Our power is gone. This is the only place we've got power, because we've been told, stay indoors, don't do this, don't do that. All of our freedom has gone. This is the only place we're going to have freedom. People are going to exercise it. They're going to. And because of where they are, maybe been furloughed, lost their jobs, all of the frustrations around what we've experienced. And what that does, it heightens people's intensity around who they want to blame, who they want to blame. And often it might be immigrants or whoever. And the vitriol is a lot worse. It is, because they've had nowhere else to put it. Out it comes. Something might happen on social media they see. And whereas before they wouldn't be bothered with commenting, now they're going to comment. And it's almost misplaced. But now they're going to comment, and they're going to be as horrible and as nasty as they want, because we are all cooped up. And this has impacted on us mentally and emotionally in a way that we've never had this before. So people are behaving in ways that they probably didn't before, or they're actually being more honest now through their anger.
Yeah, interesting thought there. Yeah, is it actually just bringing things out that were already there? And I saw someone commented in the chat around that as well. Yeah. Yeah. Sasha and Hugh, any thoughts on that? Or should we move on to another question?
No, I agree with what Paul said. I'm happy to move on.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, another question in the Q&A coming in from Facebook here about the place of corporations on social media. So often we'll see, like, and I guess a recent example is this whole like Con the Caterpillar thing, like corporations sort of trying to take on this very like personal persona to go again and to sort of try to sort of take that sense of authenticity from people posting. So what really should be the place of people, sort of corporations posting on social media, do you think?
Who's got a thought on that one? Corporations, Sasha.
I think it's a tricky one, because, for example, the corporations like Ben and Jerry, I know they had a lot to say in support and standing in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, and being, you know, a massive company, be that ice cream or whatever you want to sell, they had a lot of influence and a lot of say in that. So that support was actually well received and did a lot, I would say. In terms of other corporations, I guess social media is social media. It's a platform for really anyone that wants to engage in conversation. I would say, depending what conversations that those corporations are having in, I think that is the difference. Like if you're more into politics, for example, and you want to have buy-in, or you want to fund different campaigns to make them, you know, go further, I think that's a different conversation. If you're just using social media to spread awareness or joining a particular you know, campaign that highlights injustices around the world, sure. But if you're going a campaign and you're funding different political parties, I feel like there needs to be transparency in that, and you can't do it behind the book. So that's what I would say about that.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, because corporations are also aligned sometimes to political parties. Yeah. Paul, you've got your hand up.
Yes, very briefly, I'm aware of the time. Around George Floyd being murdered, and around the Black Lives Matter thing, I had a lot of organisations come to me and say, look, we've got to put something out on social media. What's the right thing to put out? What should we put out? Well, you know, because for me, businesses, the cynic in me, they have an agenda. They want to be viewed and seen the right way. And for me, this is one of the issues for me, because I said to a lot of people, well, hold on, what's going on in your organisation? And they're like, what do you mean? I said, well, what you're putting this out because you want to be viewed a certain way, you want to be seen a certain way, you have a brand, you want people to like it, you want people to know that you're down with everyone and you understand the situation. Okay, are you implementing all of this in your organization? Well, no, you're not. So why are you? I said to them, better off you saying nothing and using this to actually internalize and look at your own organization. So that's the thing for me. Sometimes, yes, you have people doing it the right way, but I'm always a cynic based on the experience I've had with organizations.
And actually there, I think I'd throw in, because obviously a big event coming out in the near future is Pride Month. And we're about to see millions of corporations putting on little rainbow filters onto their accounts. And absolutely, you got that same issue of it's almost profiting. And actually some of these corporations will put out products with like, you know, rainbow branding kind of stuff going forward. And it really is a question about what are you doing to actually realise the movement that has made this part of your agenda.
Yeah, I think there was a similar discussion around International Women's Day, brands that turn their logos pink, who actually have a huge gender pay gap and have no women in their senior leadership team. It's, yeah, similar thing, yeah. We've probably just got time for one more question, one or two maybe. Are there any more, Alex?
Well, I think no better person to take the final question than from my boss, Louise, who has put in the chat. Do you think social media exacerbates people's existing behaviour, or does it just expose it? Were the echo chambers and divisions always there, or were they always this bad?
Hugh, you're nodding there. What's your thoughts on that?
I haven't got any evidence. I haven't seen any evidence about this. I think it's a very good question. I think a lot of the discussion we've had today sort of would lead you to think that it does just exacerbate it. And I think probably football's a good example in that, as Paul said, in the throughout his career and since, I've often felt uncomfortable about going to football matches because of some of the stuff I'd hear on the terrace. And similarly, you hear it in other sporting spaces. But I think over time, certainly over the last 10 years, and maybe a bit longer, it's become pretty unacceptable to say some of those things. And we're fairly aware now that if you do say in a football ground and it's heard, then you will be thrown out and probably banned for life from that football club. Whereas social media, we don't yet have all of those controls. So it does enable, as Paul has been saying, it does enable it to be exacerbated and for people to just say whatever they want to say. And as Paul said, being self-isolating, all of us sort of being isolated from each other makes that even worse, because there isn't that naturalizing effect of being able to talk to one another. Whilst I've got the chance, I just wanted to pick up the point around corporations. I think it also depends on platforms, because I think we've talked a lot about Twitter and Facebook today. I mean, LinkedIn's a platform I use quite a lot, and I think corporations use a lot. And I think it's an example of a platform that actually has a very different tone and feel to it, in that there's very little abuse on LinkedIn. I mean, I haven't seen the statistics, but I've never seen any actually. And so I think it's a completely different platform used by corporations and by people in corporations in a very different way, often because of the algorithms and what you're allowed to put on there to have much wider debates about topics and to share more information. And so maybe what we need is more LinkedIn type platforms and fewer of the others. I mean, that's a question rather than an answer. But I think it's important to remember that there are more other platforms do exist.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, Paul.
Very, very briefly again, because I realised time. I think I got this off social media. Actually, I think I saw it when we're talking about behaviours and practices. I think it's something that something along the lines of Will Smith said, about let's say the racism. He said something along the lines of, no, it's never gone away. It's just now being filmed, and that is what we're saying. Is the behaviour's always been there. It's now far more documented. So, for example, when what happened to George Floyd happened, you're aware that after that on social media, there were so many videos that came up of police abuse to young Black and ethnic minority people. So are we saying that they only happened because of George Floyd? No, they've always been there. The behavior's always been there. But now all of a sudden, people have the courage to actually film it because they now know there's a forum where people will take it seriously. And I think that's because of what happened to George Floyd. It seemed to change everyone, irrespective of skin color. People started to look at it and go, whoa. I don't know why, because it's happened for years before, but that seems to have been a game changer. And now you're seeing a whole host of abusive behaviors being filmed and documented.
Yeah, for sure. Sasha.
Sorry, just coming in really quickly as well. I agree with what the others have said, but also when looking at, for example, social media, it allows you to be nameless. It allows you to say what you really want to say without any actual real consequences. And I think that's when looking, for example, at LinkedIn, I think the thought just came to me now, is LinkedIn is a professional site. So nobody in their right mind will go on LinkedIn and say, call so-and-so, X, Y, and Z, because they damn well know that person knows where you worked when you were 15. Like, there's no way you would willingly go and destroy your life. But social media, Twitter, you can at your handle, you can become whoever you want to become. And it's not like Paul said, it's not like these things have, I woke up tomorrow and racism existed. It's kind of like it's always been around. It's just being viewed by the world more often because we're connected in so many different ways. As well as, for example, just to touch on what Paul mentioned, is because things are being filmed, it's not necessarily only a national pledge for justice. It's become like a global solution for human rights. So not only do you have the accountability of your next door neighbor, you have someone in, I don't know, Thailand saying, this is not right. And that puts pressure. Global pressure makes change. And we need to, I think social media is going to shift the narrative of being nationalist to a global citizen. And I think that's what hopefully will happen with social media.
Yeah, fantastic, Sasha. That's a great note to end on. So thank you so much. So thank you to all three of you, fantastic panelists. Thank you, Paul, Hugh and Sasha. And thank you, Alex, for all the organising. And for everyone listening, if you're not already following all of the Bylines network, follow each of the Bylines sites. There's different articles on each one. Follow the Bylines podcast as well. There's some great content there, some great interviews there. And we will see you for the next webinar. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
And thank you to Mo for being such a fantastic host.
Yes, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Nice to meet you all.
Thanks.
Bye.
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 Bye, guys.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Bye, Alex. See you.